My name is Eirik Storesund, or Eirik Storesund, however you prefer to pronounce that in English. I I'm an Old Norse philologist by title. Not that that really matters so much because that's not what I do as a day job by any means. But I run a blog and a podcast called Brute Norse, and yeah, I don't know what else there is to say about that, maybe, but
You could tell me what Old Norse philology is.
Old Norse philology is philology is actually the study of language and culture through words, basically, or rather the study of culture through language, you might say.
Okay. And what got you into studying Old Norse philology?
I think that's kind of a long story in a sense, because I had this kind of like um, I kind of reinvented myself in my teenage years a little bit, where I really got into I got really interested in folklore actually and archaeology. That was kind of the back road into the written word, so to speak. And I didn't actually think that I would study Old Norse philology specifically because I didn't know that it existed. I knew I was interested in folklore. I was interested in Norse mythology, and I was interested in archaeology, but I did not know at the time that I could actually study the written sources primarily.
Mm-hmm.
And I got into Old Norse at the university by actually doing medieval studies. And it was kind of awkward because I asked one of the professors during the very first semester, I think, when we were still doing the introductory course to medieval studies.
Yeah.
I asked him how I could get more into the sagas, the Viking Age stuff,
Yeah.
basically. And I probably termed myself in very naive phrasing because, of course, when you're just starting out, you don't really know what the limits are, how things are properly done, what the corpus is. And so I think I basically told him that I wanted to study like the culture and religion of the Vikings. And this professor was a historian, like the people who have like a PhD in history or a professorship in history.
Yeah.
And he basically just kind of played stupid with me and said, well, "What do you mean? We don't really have sources from the Viking Age." He said.
Oh, he took you
It
very
did that.
literally.
It did that. That kind of mental game with me,
Mm-hmm.
and I thought it was kind of awkward because that made me think a lot about, you know, what the heck does he mean about that? We got the source, we got the sagas and stuff like that. Of course, in hindsight, it's obvious what he meant. Really, it was just being difficult.
Yeah.
Because we got the Eddic literature, we have the sagas, and all of this stuff that is written in the Middle Ages, but describes things retrospectively. And then you have archaeology, which can or cannot be reconciled fully with those sources. And yeah, basically, it was only after that I fully became aware of what Norse philology was. But it wasn't really thanks to him; it was through other professors in the same field.
Yeah.
But I think I credit that as the big like aha moment, where I was actually like on the trail of becoming an archaeologist, really, and then realizing that I could study it exclusively through language and the written word, or not exclusively, because my education is very interdisciplinary in a sense. I've done archaeology as well. I did museology, uh, cultural history, religious studies, that sort of thing as well.
Mm-hmm.
Philology is sort of where my main focus lay, and that I developed an affinity towards, and also I developed a respect for the tradition, which is probably why I define myself as an Old Norse philologist, because I think that that is not um, a discipline that will survive very long into the modern age.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I think that academia will have to redefine itself quite significantly to kind of overcome some of the struggles that it's having in the information age with the modern economy, with the job market, all of those things, really. Um, yeah, but that's kind of maybe a different issue.
Well, we'll see. We might get there.
Yeah.
So your podcast and blog, they deal specifically with the culture of the, I don't know, would you call it, is it called the Viking era in Norway? Is that what you would call it?
Yeah. Well,
Is
we
it?
call it the Viking era.
Yeah. Um,
Vikingtiden is the is the word, which directly means uh, the Viking time.
yeah.
But yeah, that's a whole different terminological question. Actually, I think that Brute Norse developed to become more like an attempt at exploring the long-term legacy of ancient Scandinavian history. So also like prehistoric
Mm-hmm.
eras, of which the Viking Age, I guess, is defined as being the latter of them, but also the Middle Ages. So from antiquity into the Middle Ages, and also actually quite a bit of later eras as well, because I suppose I can also credit that somewhat to my education, because my mentor at the university was Eldar Heide,
Mm-hmm.
who is he has a PhD in Old Norse philology as well, but he is one of the founders of something called retrospective methods. So he's like, it was a co-founder of the retrospective methods network, which uses folklore and later sources to try to dig into older material.
Hmm.
So it's kind of like, you know, how you often use older sources to explain something that comes later, which you of course are very familiar with in your field.
Mm-hmm.
So with retrospective methods, you're kind of doing the opposite. You're trying to understand Norse mythology basically through, for example, Norwegian folklore.
That makes
So I'm
sense.
sure that you probably touched upon this many times already in your work, maybe, and on the podcast, of course.
So what do you the podcast is dealing with these issues, but I'm curious like what it principally does. I mean, obviously it does a lot, but like what, when people go to listen to your podcast, what do you think they're going there for mainly? Like what kind of experience, or you know, they're walking around in bodies. What is this podcast doing to their mind, body, spirit?
That's a very good question, and a difficult one to answer actually, because I think that Brute Norse is just one kind of stage of a long-term attempt at understanding or uh, coming to terms with how I best express myself,
Hmm.
because it came as a result basically after like a long dark night of the soul, where I realized that I wouldn't become a university professor. I wasn't gonna pursue a PhD,
Mhm.
and you know, I wanted to become part of like uh, a different kind of academia, maybe often inspired by museology and these um, kind of new paradigms that are developing there, that the museum exhibit doesn't have to be in the institution. It can be in a bar, it can be in an art space or something like that. And so I experimented with many different things, and Brute Norse actually started out as a Q&A, which was purely informational,
Hmm.
about where I want to bring, well, a updated information on you know uh, from the scholarly forefront in a way into, you know, the masses,
Yeah.
and also bring some of the kind of funny anecdotes and the banter that you would get in you know, at lunchtime at the university,
Yeah.
because there's so much that just never makes it out there. There's so many funny little tidbits, and that's what I wanted to expose originally. And I wanted it to be much more broad than it ended up being.
Hmm.
But I guess because I was always interested in counterculture and subcultures myself, it always just kind of seemed to go into these niche territories and these very particular and weird subjects.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to try to answer the question, maybe I've some of the feedback that I got, some of the early feedback. I don't get so much feedback anymore. I got a lot of feedback initially. But some of the feedback I got on the early episodes of the podcast, that seems to be what people are mainly interested in. They're interested in in well, the fact that, well, what they said was that they were very happy about the fact that I had a podcast where I didn't dumb things down,
Hmm.
where I didn't simplify things, and that left people almost kind of dumbfounded afterwards, and they felt like they had to listen to the episode twice.
Mhm.
And that surprised me a little bit. And those episodes were particularly the ones where I was cooperating with my friend Axel Klausen, who's kind of my sidekick, especially on the more archaeologically centered episodes. So he's an
Yeah.
archaeologist, very much in the same situation as I am,
Hmm.
and a friend of many years as well. We're from the same area, and gone through many kind of phases of disillusionment and inspiration together. But the other thing maybe that many associate Brute Norse with is the more iconoclastic aspect of it, that I'm often kind of trying to bust myths, or uh, trying to correct perceived wrongs or kind of like misdirections in the field of, maybe, what should I say, Old Norse fandom.
That's a good expression.
Yeah.
Yeah.
uh, but it's, I think that there's kind of this kind of sardonic and kind of devilish humoristic aspects to Brute Norse that doesn't always uh, shine through to everybody, because I think that many people think that Brute Norse, oh, this is this kind of snarky guy who who just steps on people's dreams and the perceived notions, and
Mhm.
is a total naysayer in terms of like idiosyncrasies and that sort of thing. And that's maybe a shame, but also obviously something I can definitely understand with the tone of voice that I sometimes have.
Hmm. I hadn't thought of it that way, but um, I can see how you might. Like, I know that I'm sure there's a lot of like Viking reenactors who would listen to your podcast or sort of like
Mm,
go to you for guidance
yeah.
on authenticity or something, and so they might be disappointed to find that they've been wrong about something.
Yeah, it's nobody wants to be in a situation where they feel like the time and the passion that they've invested in a project has been kind of like in the wrong direction, or that they've made mistakes,
Mhm.
because they will have to go back and correct it, right?
Yeah.
And I've had many of those painful experiences myself, but at the end of the day, I'm always happy that I've had them, you
Hmm.
know. And sometimes I do think that the whip is can be more powerful than the carrot, but the combination of the two is probably the best way forward, because you can have like the little reward at the end. I think that especially with authenticity, it's very rewarding work to do things meticulously, and I think that also uh, I think that some of the pain comes from being unsatisfied, but there's also some peace to be had in a lack of satisfaction in these subjects, because at the end of the day, a lot of what draws us to the Viking Age or any other period of the past, of course, is the sense of mystery maybe that it gives us. At least that's how it is for me.
Hmm.
I don't know how it is for everybody else, but I'm very much inclined towards mystique and big questions that cannot be easily answered, and so it's very, yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that tangent maybe, but
No, I'm following. It sounds like it's
maybe
like,
I'm off the track too.
no, it's great. I was like, oh, awesome. No, I think about it in those terms a lot. And I think that it's actually good when you find that you weren't where you thought you were, because I mean, that what we don't know about the past is endless.
Yeah,
There's always
absolutely.
room for more not knowing.
I've gone through so many circles of just thinking that I know how it's all, figured out, thinking I've figured it all out, and then realizing that I really don't understand it. I think at some point somebody at the university told me that, we know so little about the pre-Christian Scandinavian world. And I remember just instinctively objecting to it and thinking that we know so much more than we think we do. And there's so much we can piece together And there are so many little details and snippets and things we can just weld together, and we can create it. But no, at the same time, there is so much that is overlooked. There are so many things that we can still do, but there's so much more that we simply have no idea about, how it actually was, you know.
Mm-hmm.
The perceptions and the attitudes of you know, people like you and I in everyday situations. Just take the sagas, for example. They have vast dialogues and like all sorts of situations, describing events that only the people described could have known about. You know, the saga authors don't know what went on in that room 300 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Had to make it up, you know,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the time. And I'm not a person who is full of extreme skepticism towards the sagas as source material at all.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very positive, to these sources for a number of reasons, but we have to be realistic about what exactly they are saying and what the limitations of these authors are in many regards. But I think that that doesn't take away my enthusiasm for it. I think it increases my enthusiasm in many regards. I think that some people have this realization that, because there are things that we cannot be certain about, then we cannot be certain about anything. You know, as if certainty is a goal in itself, you know, which I
Yeah.
don't think it is.
I think they're in the wrong field if that's what they're looking.
Yes, absolutely. I think many of them move on to more like, the harder sciences of philology. They end up like looking for Anglo-Saxon A's in the manuscripts or something like that, or, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Here. Sip break.
Yeah.
So why do you think that, I don't know if this is true, but it seems to me that people are leaning more towards the past, and specifically a sort of mysticism of the past,
Yeah.
in recent popular culture. Can you say why you think that is?
I can only speak for myself, but I feel, and especially maybe when I was younger, and you know, the kind of the child, I guess, is the father or the mother, depending on how you see it, of the adult. And I was very much looking for rootedness and a sense of belonging when I was in my teenage years, especially. And that has resulted in a person, who has a very profound sense of self. I feel very connected to my heritage. And I think that, that is something that many people are looking for.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was lucky to be born in a culture that I found it very easy to identify with, and I found it very easy for me to enjoy, the folklore and the history of the country, or rather, you know, the region that I lived in. I don't think that like the nationality is very important in this question. I think that, that the cultural complex you're born into, and your immediate surroundings, first and foremost, maybe your family, you know, yourself in the middle, and then concentric circles outwards, you know.
Yeah.
I think that that grounding is something that people are looking for. And yeah, I was lucky to be able to find that in a way. And the fact that I'm studying that I studied this specific chunk of the past is kind of incidental. It's what I was interested in, but I think that the whole past totally is important, whether we're talking about your great grandmother or some obscure faceless figure that was, you know, your ancestor 2,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think that modern society, often does not cater to this, desire and curiosity towards the past. It seems that society is always insisting on the importance of the new and the fresh point of view. Um, One of the slogans that I try to use as often as I can with Brute Norse is walking backwards into the future.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this idea that, you know, maybe it's kind of paradoxical, because, you know, if you're walking backwards, you cannot see what's in front of you, maybe. But it's sort of like moving forward, uh, and sort of trusting in and being inspired by past perspectives, because at the end of the day, the people who lived in the past were not that different from us, certainly not anatomically speaking. Maybe the content of the their handed down philosophy was different, but I think that at the end of the day we have the same inclinations and the same um, yeah, some of the same interests and lackings and desires as people, in the past did.
Mhm.
I think if one of my favorite works of all time is, of course, the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Yeah.
And certain versions of that epic does voice concerns about human mortality and the human condition that are, in my opinion, quite timeless. And it is my belief, and certainly what I hope as well, that by understanding and coming to terms with the past for all the better and worse aspects of our nature,
Mhm.
that we will be more content people. Right? I don't think that the past can offer definite answers to the human condition, but I don't think that we're here to have the answer either.
Mhm.
If you get my gist.
Yeah. So you have rather, like, you talk about time a lot in your blog and your podcast, and concepts of the future and the past.
Yeah.
And is that how you would articulate your sort of concept of time, or is there more to it than that?
Well, when I graduated at the University of Bergen, I was actually stuck uh, in the same reading room as a bunch of literature students and people who were on the fast track to becoming high school teachers and that sort of thing. I wanted to be with the anthropologists and the archaeologists, but due to the quirks of academia, I was grouped together with the Nordicists.
Mhm.
And there was one guy there who commented that I seemed obsessed with the archaic. That was like something that had been kind of brewing in his mind, it seemed, for a while, and he wanted to ask me about what gives with this obsession over everything that is old. And it was an extremely interesting question, just by how confrontational it was. And I didn't really understand it. I didn't have a proper answer to give at the time, and maybe I still don't. But I think I am obsessed with the passing of time and how things change over time and what does not change over time, you know. And I'm also interested, I think that what I'm really interested in is trying to reconcile the past with the future in a way, which probably is totally impossible and will probably give me something to wonder about for many years to come, probably throughout my life. But where it comes from and where it's headed, I really don't know.
Fantastic. Thank you. Um, hmm, I have a question for you.
Yes.
You made a controversial statement online before that I found really, I don't know if it's controversial, but to me it's interesting.
Mhm.
You were saying that Old Norse religion or spirituality was not nature worship,
Yeah.
and I was really interested in how you explain that. I'd love it if you could explain to me more.
Yeah. First of all, I'm very happy that you say that you quote me correctly there and say that I do not think it's nature worship. Um, it's a different question whether or not it is nature religion. But nature religion, if we can talk about um, the history of the idea and the notion first, has all sorts of connotations today. I think that one is the sort of disproven naturalistic point of view that you have with James Fraser and the Golden Bough,
Mhm.
where you basically assert that all religions, especially primitive, so-called primitive religions, see the world just as a set of metaphors that are just clad in this holy mumbo jumbo. They see lightning and they think, oh, that must be God, or something like that. They cannot conceive of something, a naturalist, like a more rational explanation for it. So they must, resort to the divine in a way. And that is one end of it. The other is that this countercultural, more modern neo-pagan perspective that these religions are ecologically minded, and that they are kind of these stewards of nature, so to speak. I think that Norse pre-Christian religion was neither of the two. I don't think that it was a primitive philosophy of the world, but I also do not think that the Norse pre-Christian religion was a religion of stewardship for the earth either. Because I think that, to say like nature religion, of course, nature, we can choose to define nature as the entire world, the entire cosmos. And of course, then there could be nothing to escape nature. Everything would be nature.
Yeah.
But we can ask ourselves, is Hinduism a nature religion? It's a polytheistic religion, and the gods can manifest in the natural world and whatnot. Or is Christianity a nature religion? If we look at like Saint Francis or something like that, we find aspects perhaps of a nature-centered spirituality there. It maybe not. Depends on how how you define these big and very complex and not very helpful terms, really. But in saying this, I suppose that I define nature not as the world, but an aspect of the world. And Old Norse religion saw, for instance, people as a creation of the gods that stands out in the world. Humans are separated from animals for a number of reasons, and we're created in the image of the gods, and we have similar inclinations and motivations as the gods do. And the activities of the gods justify human culture. And human culture is about cultivation. It's about surviving in a very hostile world. And I think that the whole question of ecology as we have it today, the ecological consciousness, is a question that would be partially kind of beyond the reaches of people back then. They would probably not understand exactly what we meant by these concerns at all. But Old Norse religion was certainly a religion where people could find the divine manifested in natural phenomena, of course, I would not deny. But I do not think that Old Norse religion in itself was nature worship by any means. You might as well say that it was worship of culture. I think that even that would be a more a fair way to assess it, but it would be it would not be a good and fair terminology either, I think. So yeah, and that statement was deemed a bit controversial, but it was celebrated by some people. And the whole debate that I had with the brilliant Matthias Norvig of the University of Colorado Boulder, we went back and forth a little bit. I actually never replied to his to the second round there because I didn't, I thought I had other things to do. So I just kind of like let him have that victory. But I think that at the end of the day, we were actually more in agreement than disagreement about it. It was just like, it ended up being a discussion of definitions,
Yeah.
And whether or not like historical paganism, if we can call it that, is or was ecologically conscious in any way, which I don't think it was, because I think that they were quite capable of ruining their environment, and they certainly did on numerous occasions. They deforested Iceland, they drove the walrus away from the northern peripheries. They caused a lot of ecological havoc. I don't think that this was a very eco-centered religion at all, and if that is the measure of it. But whether or not it was, or if modern neo-paganism is by default, or whether it should be conscious of human damage to the natural world, those are two different questions as far as I'm concerned. And I think it's sort of like what I'm trying to do partially with Brute Norse. If people ask me what sort of ideology I have. I cooked up this term Scandi-futurism, which was just a term I came up with just to have something comfortable to just term my combination of old and new, and often in these kind of futuristic ways.
Mm-hmm.
So Scandi-futurism, in a way, is an attempt to reconcile the old with the new, and almost like futuristic to the point of science fiction. And I think that this works very well with Eddic mythology, because Eddic mythology teaches that the world is created almost as a collage by the gods. There's something already there when the gods come. They just start assembling it like you would build a house, or you would, or and this is not random terminology on my part, of course, but I think that the gods, in a sense, are artists, and they start doing this, and the world is not a perfect place. The world is full of this tension and this battle between different forces that they fight, and they also cooperate sometimes, but the world is what it is, for better or worse.
Mm-hmm.
And if we take the Eddas at face value, the world will also end because of these inclinations in nature and culture. And the gods have already set the seed for the end of the world by the way that they act, and humans will participate in the destruction of the world. And then maybe everything will be fine again in the end. It will come full circle.
Mm-hmm.
But it's almost this this metaphor that you also find in Hinduism, actually, this they call it prakriti, which is that like energy is always transferred into something else. You cannot create from nothing.
Mm-hmm.
For something to be strengthened, something else must be weakened. Something is always being transferred onto something else, and that is kind of just the state of the world. And in the end, that results in Ragnarok, or you could call it, what is this this term, the heat death of the universe, or however you want to to phrase it. You could use modern scientific metaphors to describe the same process, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But in the end, there's no such thing as free lunch, basically.
No. Or as destruction at the same time.
Yeah, but I think that paganism, now I'm moving away from the objective and into the subjective, maybe, but I see paganism as a philosophy not of how the world ought to be, but how the world is. It's an observational philosophy. And so I do not think that paganism is about seeing the world as if we had a fall from grace, that we were living as monkeys in the trees, and that was all fine and dandy, and then we became these horrid creatures that live in houses and create parking lots over beautiful forests or whatever, and that is worse. I think that, of course, that the latter is kind of a horrible thing, the urban sprawl and all of that thing. I definitely think that the industrialization is one of the more kind of grim processes that have happened to the human race, really. But I think that it's not about whether or not these things are good or bad. It's about trying to understand that this is actually how things are, and what can we do with it from there on. What can we do to force, to push the doom away? How can we overcome these inclinations in ourselves? Because the human beings are certainly not perfect creatures, but nor are the gods, if you understand. So I think that there's nothing in itself, there's no oxymoron in considering yourself a pagan and living in New York City as I do. It's I don't think that living in the big city is the best way for a person to live, but it's also in some regards not the worst. It's not a very sustainable world to live in. And you can just tell New York City is built on old forests and Indian settlements, and Broadway across this peninsula here on Manhattan was built on an Indian path, I believe, Native American path. And so you can
It's
still
called
see
Broadway.
traces.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I believe it is. And it doesn't go straight through the city. New York City has this grid system
Yeah.
that goes like perfectly squarely across the city, at least parts of it. And but Broadway just kind of goes like, it kind of bends through it. And it's because it was an organic pathway,
Mhm.
probably created over many generations before Europeans ever came.
Mhm.
And nonetheless, I think that New York City, for all its, synthetic, you know, plastic grimness, is a genuine, expression of human nature, just as much as, a carved wooden idol might be, or a campsite, or
Mhm.
something like that. It's just a matter of scale, really. If you have too much of something, it's not good. And I'm not saying this as just an urbanite either. I used to live in in a, I called it the swamp, but I used to live in like this wetland forest in West Norway before I moved here to be with my wife, and I had to like melt snow every winter and stuff like that. I think that lifestyle then just kind of fortified my perspective that the human interaction with nature is about struggle in parts, but of course there are beautiful moments, and there's um, a reciprocal trust that should ideally be established between nature and culture, but
Mhm.
isn't always there. No.
Thank you.
Sorry if that was long-winded, but
It's exactly what I'm looking for.
thank you.
I have a question. I think maybe the final question. Um, I wonder what if you could, if money was no object and things went the way you wanted them to, what would be the sort of big um, goal of this research and this way of life for you?
Oh my God, that is
Unless that was
that is a very big question. I honestly don't know. I think that I had these, I have these visions every now and then, that I would find other mediums as well to express my ideas, and maybe try to express them less verbally. I think I would do a lot more artistic work if I had the means to do so. But I think that at the end of the day, I think it's just very important to support local initiatives and support um, things that help maintain and keep the past alive, folk traditions and that sort of thing. And I really don't know how to achieve it, apart from doing stuff like you do with this podcast, or my project, trying to get people involved, and try to kind of show people how things can be done by just doing it yourself, setting an example. But it's very hard to find a way that is kind of outside of the big, consumerist bubble that is here. I don't want to just create another movie or something like that. If somebody wants to see films that kind of express my worldview, I can send them to see like Koyani Skatsi or something like that. Um, but yeah, no, I think I would just like, if money wasn't an option, I would definitely live on a nice big farm in the countryside somewhere, and I would uh, probably end up doing what many other people do when they have the means to do so, just spit a lot of money into projects they love.
Yeah.
But of course, that's a big problem, because money really isn't the answer to these things.
Mhm.
I think that the only way forward is actually like getting out there and learning crafts, or at least learning some sort of vocation or something like that. I feel like my vocation happens to be um, that I know a dead language, and I cannot, or I probably could, but as many other people, I've failed to become the Renaissance man that I read about in the books. You know, when you read these old authorities who could, you know, who knew like 5 different dead languages and could converse in a number of living ones. But those people had dedicated their whole lives to just becoming that way, and they came from these big bourgeois families, maybe, and you know, most people do not have the attention span for that today, and certainly not me. You know.
I think you're doing great.
Well, thank you. I'm doing what I can, but I'm but a man among men, I guess.
So what's the next step? What are you working on right now? What's making you
Right
excited?
now, I'm trying to create podcasts relatively consistently, and maybe not making so damned long ones, because it's, you know, making podcasts that are like an hour or 2 hours long. It takes a lot of work, you know. I always like listening to very long podcasts, but the longer a podcast is, the more editing has to be done. And I think that with my style, they're often so concentrated with um, things that I probably don't even have to have in them, you know, just these little facts, little variants that I feel are important, but may not really be that important to the audience.
Mhm.
But other than that, I'm also trying to spread out and do more like physical stuff, do more publications,
Mhm.
um, working on translating some work. I'm also trying to write a book where maybe my philosophy of the world will be better outlined than I can describe it today. Uh, but it's based on an article that I wrote a while back called "The Trollish Theory of Art."
Mhm.
It's actually one of the things that people have been bugging me about. They say that they want my essays to come in book form, which I cannot directly promise, you know. And I should be careful about talking about this because, of course, the writing you talk about, you never do. But
Yeah.
um, yeah, well, I'm trying to write a book, and if it will be any good, that's you know, time will tell, I guess.
Yeah. Time. I look forward to seeing it if or when you decide.
Well, so am I.
Yeah.
It will be interesting, but it's very, writing is very frustrating work. Actually, I don't know if people understand it very much. You know, I hate to be the guy on the podcast who brings out, you know, Bukowski, because it's such like, it seems like such a pretentious thing to do.
Mhm.
But I think he said something very interesting once that always stuck with me, uh, and maybe also because it fits the Brute Norse style very well. It says that if you don't have a burning passion or desire to create, you know, or I think he says to write, if you don't have that like thing in you that drives you to write one more line, then don't do it, you know. Because it's like writing and creating stuff is a whole lot of misery and frustration. But I think that the hidden kind of like gem in this quote is that if you do have this, you know, you cannot help it, you know. It sounds very discouraging to tell people off, you know, say don't do this, you're not good enough. No, if you think, if you have this drive, you won't, maybe if you've never written before, you won't think that people are interested in what you're doing, you know.
Mhm.
Like the first article I ever wrote was like, nobody's interested in reading this, you know. And you know, if I didn't have that doubt, I would have started writing a long time before.
Mhm.
But I think once I actually started writing, I totally understood what he meant, I think.
Mhm. I don't know how you could keep going if you didn't have that burning passion anyway. It
No,
was
exactly, yeah.
perhaps
And I think that there's a hidden encouragement in those words, in his kind of like, you know, in the arrogance of his phrasing there, I think, which is what I'm hoping to achieve maybe with Brute Norse. I never want to tell anybody not to do anything or tell anybody to, you know, to flip off, you know. I know that this is a family friendly podcast, so I'm not going to swear, but um but yeah, I think it's important to have this kind of to have it both, in a way, to have the straight talk, but also not to take yourself too seriously when you do it, you know. That there is kind of like this carnivalesque aspect to it. If you're being mean, at least try to be funny while you're being it, you know.
Mhm. or only expect to be right 40% of the time.
Yeah, exactly. You know,
Thinking.
I think it's, you know, I try at least to be very humble. So, and especially, you know, if I'm using very strong language, I expect that people will use very strong language with me too. And I'm actually quite delighted when people do. Yeah, um, but yeah, I think that that's also the trouble with the written medium, you know, because it's very hard to communicate irony or comedy with it, and some people struggle more to get those cues than others, of course. And
Well, and saying if you don't have a burning passion to write, you shouldn't, also implies that you know, you should find the thing that you do have a burning passion to do instead.
that is true. That is
Not
true.
that it's just an elitist activity, but that you'd be better service in a different place, maybe.
Yeah, that kind of ties into like what I have. One of the things that I'm also very interested in, but I haven't discussed here, and I don't mention too much, but I also don't hide it very well, is that I'm very interested in like contemporary esotericism and magic.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, that's, you know, in one of the big greats there, you have of course the always the perpetually controversial Aleister Crowley, you know, with his, you know, do what thou wilt, you know.
Yeah.
You know, which is basically the whole thing, you know. You gotta find what you're meant to do in a way. Are we really meant to do anything specific? I don't really know, but those I definitely think that in that regard, in that we don't even have to resort to Crowley. I think we can go to, say, Alan Moore, you know, that you can create magic in the world, and in such brute Norse is also a magical endeavor. I don't think I've ever phrased it that way in public before. Maybe I have on the blog, but nobody reads that.
I don't
So
disagree.
but but no, I think even the color scheme of brute Norse is premeditated in that regard. I use a lot of purples and that sort of thing, which is you know, the kind of like the magician's color in many of these like contemporary esoteric philosophies, or Western esoteric tradition.
Mm-hmm.
um,
Well, I think that's a good point to end it on.
yeah.
Yeah, I think brute Morse is brute Norse is a magical endeavor.
Brute Morse, yeah.
Brute Morse, brute Morse code. That's the next level.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, just be kind to one another, and stay curious, and support local craftspeople, and submerge yourself in your local traditions. Yeah, I have this thing I kind of like. I'm working on for the book that is as much a research tool as maybe also a subject for a chapter of the book itself, which is that I've come to find a lot of parallels with Norse mythology and the subway system, and the character of Odin, and kind of the could I call it an archetype? I don't know, of the drifter or the bum, or the any person who's perceived as this kind of like bottom feeder of society, that is kind of like shuffling around and is kind of feared, and kind of either evokes disgust or pity among, you know, people that pass them by, but they're never regarded as very noble creatures in a way. But
Yeah.
I've had this thing that I almost like, one of the terms that I've experimented with is hobomancy, which involves being alert, kind of like aware of the presence
Mm-hmm.
of these people, or more generally actually of like encounters on the subway
Mm-hmm.
and on the stations,
Mm-hmm.
and seeing if I can draw some sort of like conclusions from it, or like it's a divination system really.
Oh yeah, it's a very good.
where I'm like, I'm using these figures as oracles,
Mm-hmm.
but in a very like I think that my theory so far is that I must not intervene with them, or like I must not affect their behavior in any way. I must just observe. But I don't know, it hasn't really really yielded many fruitful results. There was a one train passed by, and I looked at the number, and it spelled out the year that the Kalmar Union was formed. It was like that. That was like the most like tangible thing that this has resulted in so far. Apart from a lot of inspiration for my book, maybe, but on a more, uh, you know, more symbolic and less tangible level, probably. But
Mhm. That's
yeah,
fantastic. I remember I used to have a lot of more when I was a teenager. Like
yeah,
sort of old men would approach my friends and I and say cryptic things. This was a really common, especially if you know, were asking them for a lighter or something. That was you ask
yeah,
someone for a lighter and you'll get the Delphi Oracle. You know.
yes. That is actually quite interesting because I had one encounter that was very weird to me,
Mhm.
and it's probably the only like example of something that where I feel like I really couldn't explain what was going on. Because usually when something weird happens, you can say, "Oh, this is just a random incident," and you can kind of tell where it came from, or it's just like a weird coincidence or whatever. But there was one time I was in the woods, and I was actually waiting because I was involved with a lot of different, uh, historical organizations and personalities in my hometown at the time when I was about 16, 17 years old. And I think I was going to some kind of lecture at a local school with like my Viking reenactment society, which actually Viking reenactment societies sound like very youthful organizations, but in my hometown, which had one of the oldest ones in Norway,
Mhm.
um, consisted of mostly people who were at least in their 40s, mostly 50s and up. A lot
Yeah.
of pensioners, actually. And the only one who was young, apart from me, was a guy who was 24 years old or something
Mhm.
at the time when I joined. But I had a lot of time to kill, and I went into the forest, and I think I was like doing something stupid, like I was urinating or something, like in some bushes or something like that.
Mhm.
And this was in late winter, and I heard a noise that I couldn't describe that just seemed to fill the air around me and that didn't have any like tangible uh, origin, and that seemed to like vibrate and resonate very loudly and very violently. But at the same time, almost like I seem to recall that it like started almost as a whisper or something. It was very subtle at first, and it was over as soon as it began. Basically, it was almost like some sort of like tinnitus or something.
Mhm.
When ringing in your ears sort of
Mhm.
situation. And I had like this like kind of anxiety reaction to it. But I immediately kind of like decided that there's some rational explanation for this. There must be, because I think like this, like it could be the ice breaking on the nearby lake because there was a lake right by it. So rationally, that's probably what it was. Um, because I don't know if you ever heard like ice cracking on a lake. You probably have, and it's a very awe-inspiring noise.
Yeah.
Uh, and this noise, whatever it was, really freaked me out, and I couldn't explain it, and I felt very humiliated afterwards. I felt kind of mocked in a way, or this is me as an adult describing an experience that I had when I was in my teenage years. So the two are probably two separate things in reality. But this is at least what my image today is of that experience.
Mhm.
But but yeah, it was kind of like a profound like experience where I felt like definitely that this was almost like an encounter with the subterranean people or something, the hidden folk or
Mhm.
something along those lines. But eh, as as mystically inclined I am, I'm very reluctant to say to point and say this was what it was. I have no idea what it was.